The year was 1856, and the small rural town of Charleston's outskirts still bore the weight of slavery, like a heavy shroud draped over its soil. Whitewashed churches rose like monuments to piety, while just beyond their bells' reach, black men and women labored in fields under the crack of whips. It was a world of polished pews and ragged cabins, of sermons about salvation spoken by those who denied humanity to others. And it was in this paradox of faith and cruelty that the story of Clara, a young enslaved woman, would come to burn itself into memory. Clara was no ordinary figure among the enslaved. She was sharp-eyed, her thoughts quick as the wind that blew through the cotton rows, and her presence carried both a quiet obedience and an unspoken defiance. Sold into the household of the Harrows, a family who prided themselves on their social standing and their strict devotion to Sunday rituals, Clara became bound not just to labor, but to the rhythm of the church bells themselves. Each week, she was marched with the family into the grand white church, where Mistress Eliza Harrow held her head high among the other women, draped in lace and pearls. Clara trailed behind, a shadow in faded fabric, yet always seen as both useful and invisible. Mistress Eliza was known for her cruelty, cloaked in the airs of refinement. To outsiders, she was the picture of a dutiful Christian woman, yet in the privacy of her home, she wielded words like blades. Clara bore the brunt of her anger, her punishments, her constant reminders of ownership. Bruises hid beneath Clara's sleeves, and the sting of humiliation often lingered longer than the pain itself. But beneath the surface, Clara was taking note of habits, of weaknesses, of the rhythms of life that could be turned against her mistress one day. The church stood at the heart of the Harrows' world. To Mistress Eliza, it was not simply a place of worship, but a stage for power, where she performed her piety for her peers. The tall bell tower that rose above it was rung each Sunday morning to summon the faithful. And it was Clara who was often ordered to prepare the family's things for the service, polishing shoes, buttoning gowns, and ensuring that Eliza's lace gloves were spotless. With each small task, Clara's resentment deepened. The church's ringing bells, meant to call men and women to God, came to sound to Clara like chains striking against her own spirit. By the late summer of 1856, something in Clara had begun to shift. She was tired of silence, tired of being struck and scolded, tired of kneeling in prayer beside a mistress who treated her as less than an animal. Stories whispered among the enslaved traveled on the wind, tales of men and women who had resisted, who had fought back in ways small and large. The names of Nat Turner and others still lingered in the memories of the older ones, their stories passed down like seeds. And though Clara did not speak openly of rebellion, the thought rooted itself in her heart. She began to imagine what it would mean not just to endure but to strike back. The opportunity seemed to form around the church itself. Clara noticed how, on Sunday mornings, Mistress Eliza would insist on entering last, sweeping through the aisle so that all could turn to admire her. Clara would be close behind her, head bowed. And Clara also noticed the great rope of the bell that hung just behind the wooden stair to the loft, thick and heavy, smelling of hemp. She would glance at it each time she passed, and something about it filled her with a strange, dark energy. As the weeks passed, Clara's anger began to merge with this vision. She thought of how Eliza lectured her about sin and repentance, yet never repented for the cruelties she herself committed. She thought of how that bell rang each Sunday as if heaven itself called down upon the people, and how bitterly ironic it would be if its rope became the very instrument of justice. The idea was frightening, yes, but also intoxicating. For once, Clara would not be powerless. For once, the bell would not just summon worshippers, it would toll for Mistress Eliza. The plan was not fully formed yet, but Clara began to move carefully, watching, waiting. Her silence deepened, but her thoughts grew sharper. She studied the bell rope, imagining its weight in her hands. She studied her mistress's routines, her vanity, her pride. She began to feel as though the very walls of the church might conspire with her, that the building which had long been used to sanctify oppression could be turned into a stage of vengeance. By the time autumn winds swept through Charleston, Clara's decision had hardened. There would come a Sunday when Mistress Eliza, dressed in all her finery, would walk into that church without realizing that her last breath would be taken beneath the very rope that called her to prayer. And Clara, silent for so long, would become the voice of retribution. The chill of November settled over Charleston, carrying with it the rustle of dying leaves and the scent of wood smoke. Sunday mornings grew sharper in the air, but the rituals of the Harrow household remained unchanged. Clara still rose before dawn, lighting the kitchen fires, pressing her mistress's garments and smoothing the folds of lace until they shone like spider silk. Each detail mattered to Mistress Eliza, who cared less for God's approval than for the eyes of her peers. Clara understood this vanity well. It was the very pride that made her mistress careless, blind to danger, and easy to wound. Clara began to notice how Eliza demanded more from her in these colder months. If the gloves were not perfectly white, Clara was struck. If the tea was not hot enough, she was berated. If the hem of her gown dragged the slightest dust from the church floor, Clara bore the punishment. These small cruelties no longer merely bruised Clara's skin, they hardened her resolve. With each insult, the picture in her mind became clearer. Eliza suspended beneath the church bell, her lifeless body swinging where once she had strutted with pride. To the enslaved community, Clara said little. She did not trust the walls, nor the ears that might carry whispers to the overseers. But her silence became its own shield. At night, when others lay on straw pallets, Clara stared at the shadows of rafters above her, tracing lines in her mind. She thought of how to lead Eliza toward the rope, of how to use the timing of the service, of how to act quickly before cries could summon others. It was no longer a passing fantasy, but a strategy forming out of necessity and rage. The church itself grew more and more sinister in Clara's eyes. She began to linger near the bell tower when ordered to fetch or clean, brushing her hand against the coarse fibers of the rope. It was thick and heavy, frayed in places where years of pulling had worn it down. She felt its strength as though testing the sinew of a beast. She could imagine its fibers biting into skin, its weight bearing down with finality. Every touch was a rehearsal, though no one watching her suspected a thing. Eliza remained oblivious. In her mind, Clara was a tool, nothing more. The mistress took no note of the intensity with which Clara watched her lace veil being tied, or the quiet way Clara's hands gripped the edge of a pew as though testing her own strength. To Eliza, the enslaved had no inner lives, no storms beneath their still faces. This blindness, this arrogance, would prove fatal. One Sunday morning, the church was especially full, as the congregation gathered not only for service, but for a celebration of the harvest. Eliza, as always, wanted to be admired. She instructed Clara to walk behind her, carrying her fan and cloak. Clara obeyed, but her eyes darted toward the bell rope as they passed. She saw the way it swayed slightly from a draft, like an invitation. She measured the steps between the aisle and the stair. She calculated the weight of her mistress's body against the rope. Every detail pressed itself into her memory, a plan tightening like the fibers she touched. The thought of justice filled her dreams at night. In them, the churchgoers gasped, their prayers halted, as Eliza hung suspended above them. Clara would not run in these visions. She would stand silent, letting the truth ring out without a word spoken. She woke each morning with her pulse racing, her body tense, as if she had lived the act already. But Clara also knew the danger. One misstep could lead to her own death, swift and brutal. She would be whipped, hanged, or worse if her plan was uncovered. That fear lived in her chest, heavy as iron. Yet it did not stop her. It sharpened her movements, made her more careful, more deliberate. If anything, fear became her ally, forcing her to prepare every moment with precision. By late November, the church. December crept upon Charleston with a damp chill, fog rolling in from the coast and settling like a shroud over the narrow streets. For Clara, the turning of the season only deepened her resolve. Each Sunday seemed to move her closer to the day when the plan in her mind would leave the shadows and step into reality. She carried herself with quiet precision, never allowing her face to betray the storm within. To Mistress Eliza, she appeared as she always had, dutiful, silent, and bound. But beneath that silence, every heartbeat carried the rhythm of vengeance. The bell tower became Clara's secret accomplice. She had mapped its space in her mind, studied the way the rope hung just behind the stair, how it brushed the floor when the wind shifted through the high windows. She knew how quickly the heavy knot could be pulled, how tightly it might hold. She even practiced knots in small scraps of twine in the kitchen, testing her fingers' steadiness. No one noticed. No one cared what a slave girl did in the shadows, and so Clara sharpened her weapon in plain sight. Eliza grew harsher as Christmas approached. The mistress demanded richer fabrics, heavier jewels, more elaborate meals. Clara bore the extra labor without a word, but every insult fell like fuel onto the fire inside her. When Eliza slapped her across the face one evening for burning the hem of lace on an iron, Clara felt the sting not as humiliation, but as confirmation. The woman's cruelty was endless, and so Clara's justice must be absolute. On the Saturday before the second week of Advent, Clara lingered in the church under the pretense of polishing brass candlesticks. The congregation had long since left, the pews empty, the silence broken only by the faint creak of wood. She moved slowly up the narrow stair into the tower, her breath shallow in the cold. The rope hung before her, thick and pale, swaying slightly with each draft. She touched it, feeling the rough fibers scrape her palm, imagining them biting into Eliza's throat. For a long moment she stood there, her hand resting against it as though drawing strength. She whispered under her breath, words not of prayer but of promise. One day. The church bells rang out the following morning, their sound rolling across the town like a summons. Clara walked behind Eliza as always, carrying her cloak. The congregation filled the space with song, the organ rising in solemn tones. But Clara's eyes were not on the hymnals or the preacher's pulpit. They flicked toward the tower, toward the rope she had touched the night before. Every word of scripture felt drowned beneath the steady thrum of her pulse. When the service ended, Clara kept her silence. Eliza, proud as ever, lingered to speak with other women, her laughter shrill, her voice sharp with gossip. Clara carried her things dutifully, but in her chest, she carried something else, timing. She marked how many lingered, how quickly they dispersed, how the doors closed behind them. She noticed the stillness of the space when the last parishioner left. The bell rope, unseen by most, waited above, patient as ever. That night, Clara dreamed again of the act. This time, it felt closer, more vivid. She saw Eliza's body suspended, her feet kicking once, twice, then falling limp. She heard the gasp of the congregation, the sharp cry of children, the mutter of prayers twisted into horror. But in the dream, Clara did not flee. She stood tall, her hands steady, her face calm as though she had finally unburdened her soul. When she woke, her chest was damp with sweat, but her heart felt strangely lighter, as though the dream had already taken some of the weight from her. The following week passed in tense silence. Clara carried out her duties with care, but her thoughts remained on the tower. Each small cruelty from Eliza no longer cut deeply. They merely reminded Clara that the moment must come. She no longer asked herself if, only when. The Sunday of reckoning loomed. Clara knew it by the way the sky darkened with winter clouds, by the way the wind seemed to howl through the streets, carrying with it an omen. As she dressed Eliza that morning, fastening her lace gloves, smoothing her shawl, she studied the woman's neck. Pale, slender, so fragile beneath the layers of vanity. Clara's hands brushed it for a moment as though adjusting the fabric, but within her she imagined the rope closing in. When they reached the church, the bells rang again, louder than before, their toll shaking the rafters. To others, it was a call to worship. To Clara, it was a signal, one step closer. And as Eliza stepped proudly into the pews, unaware of the fate stalking her from behind, Clara's resolve solidified into iron. The day was nearly here, and nothing, not fear, not doubt, not even God's own house, would stop her. The final Sunday dawned gray, a thin mist curling over Charleston's streets as though the city itself held its breath. Clara rose before the bells, her body heavy with the weight of what she carried inside. Yet her hands did not tremble as she laid out Mistress Eliza's garments, brushed the dust from her shoes, and polished the small clasp on her cloak. Every movement was deliberate, precise, rituals of preparation not only for her mistress's vanity, but for the execution Clara had already rehearsed 100 times in her mind. Eliza, oblivious as ever, prattled on about her importance in the congregation, about the eyes that would admire her lace, and the way the preacher himself might compliment her piety. Clara's silence did not strike her as strange. She had never cared for the thoughts of the enslaved. She only cared that her appearance be flawless, that her authority remain intact. She did not see that Clara's silence had hardened into something unbreakable. The church loomed larger that morning, its spire piercing the mist, the bell tolling with a deep resonance that seemed to shake Clara's chest. The congregation filed inside, filling the pews with whispers and coughs, their hymnals snapping open in unison. Clara followed a step behind her mistress, carrying her cloak, her eyes locked not on the altar, but on the tower above. She heard nothing of the sermon, none of the scripture, none of the songs. She heard only the drum of her own pulse and the distant creak of the bell rope swaying with the winter draft. When the service ended, the parishioners lingered in the aisles, trading greetings, gossip, and laughter. Clara remained close, her expression unreadable, waiting. Slowly, the crowd thinned. Families spilled into the cold streets, their chatter fading with distance. Soon, only a handful remained, Eliza among them, speaking with a neighbor about a gown to be imported from Paris. Clara stood behind her, her gaze fixed on the stair to the bell tower. The moment revealed itself in a hush, as if heaven itself had gone still. The last voices drifted out through the doors. The preacher closed his book and stepped into the vestry. The church, for the first time that morning, was nearly empty. Clara's chest tightened. She had no more excuses to wait. "Eliza," she said quietly, her voice low, steady. It startled her mistress. Clara rarely spoke. Eliza turned, brows furrowed in irritation. "What is it now, girl?" Clara did not answer with words. Instead, she moved, swift and certain, seizing her mistress by the wrist. Eliza gasped, the lace glove twisting in Clara's grip. "Unhand me," she shrieked, but Clara's strength was a storm. She dragged her up the stair, step by step, ignoring the woman's thrashing, the kicks of her polished shoes, the screams that bounced against the stone walls. At the top, the rope hung waiting, swaying faintly in the draft from the tower's windows. Clara's breath came heavy now, her arms taut as she forced Eliza beneath it. The mistress clawed at her face, cursed her with every vile name, but Clara did not flinch. With a practiced motion, she looped the rope, tightened it, and pulled. The fibers dug into Eliza's pale throat, cutting off her scream with a choked gasp. The bell gave a low groan as the rope tightened, its sound echoing through the church like thunder. Eliza kicked, writhed, her hands clawing at the noose, her eyes wide with disbelief. But there was no mercy in Clara's face. Only resolve. Only the weight of generations pouring through her hands. For a moment, time seemed to hold still. The great church, built as a monument to faith and order, now bore witness to its mistress's downfall. The woman who had strutted proudly in her pew now swung like a grotesque ornament beneath the very bell she had admired for its piety. Her body convulsed once, twice, then went limp. The silence afterward was more deafening than the toll of the bell. Clara stood beneath her, chest rising and falling, her face calm. She did not flee at once. She let the sight burn itself into her memory, the pale body, the rope, the stillness of justice finally fulfilled. Then, Footsteps echoed faintly from below. Someone had heard. Clara descended the stair, her pace steady. Gasps erupted as parishioners re-entered, their eyes lifting to the tower, their voices breaking into screams. "My God! She's hanging!" Women fainted, men shouted. The preacher dropped to his knees in horror. Clara did not speak. She walked through the aisle, her head held high, her silence louder than any cry. Whether she was seized moments later or whether she disappeared into the fog outside, the story spread like wildfire. Some whispered that she had been caught and hanged within days, others that she escaped north, vanishing into freedom's shadows. But the truth mattered less than the image that remained. Mistress Eliza Harrow swinging from the church bell rope, her vanity silenced, her cruelty ended by the hands of the one she believed powerless. And so Clara's act lived on, a whispered legend among the enslaved, a tale of defiance told in hushed tones when the nights grew long. It was not just a killing. It was a reckoning carved into the heart of Charleston, a reminder that even in the holiest of houses, justice could be forged by the oppressed.